Hello, this is Todd Luck, and this is a review of the sword and sorcery hero who would not die, even though he's going to be canceled several times. This is a review of the original ongoing Kull series from the 1970s. This title is going to start out being called Kull the Conqueror, and it will be renamed Kull the Destroyer, but it's all the same series. It ran for 29 issues. Kull is a barbarian king who was created by pulp writer Robert E. Howard, and Robert E. Howard would rework a Kull story called By This Axe I Rule into a story called The Phoenix on the Sword, and Kull would become a character known as Conan. However, Kull had a lot of really great stories in his own right. There are a couple differences between Kull and Conan. First of all, most of Kull's stories are set when he's king, which is true of this series, and he tends to be a more noble and philosophical barbarian. However, you're not going to see a whole lot of that in the 70s stories. I think that is because Conan was just starting out back in 1971 when this began, right? They were still telling the early stories of his life, and Kull was an opportunity to show readers what a King Conan would be like. And so sometimes it is hard to tell Kull and Conan apart personality-wise back in the 70s, but one thing that did differentiate them was how epic Kull's stories were, and that absolutely made it into this series. Kull's time is earlier than Conan's. He's in an earlier era. Most of the world is unexplored, so that gives you lots of leeway of things that you can introduce. And because it's an earlier time, the pre-human evils that the early men had to overthrow in order to rule the earth are still around. Serpent men and all of this stuff, evil primordial forces are still lingering in Kull's time and are still trying to reassert their domination and take back the world from humans. Now, this is a review, but it's also going to be a guide about how to read this series because there's a few things you're probably going to want to pick up along the way to help you follow the storyline in the series. The drama about how this was published is probably as exciting as the stories themselves. Now, I'm going to give you the explanation at the time for what was going on with the series, but there's a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff I just don't know about. But what I will say is the 70s were a very difficult and tumultuous time for comics, even for Marvel, who was on top as far as sales went. And during the 1970s, when this was published, right, when this series came out, there were 7 editors-in-chief, right? This series began in 1971 with Stan Lee, and it ended in 1978 with Jim Shooter, who would go on to be the editor-in-chief during Marvel's heyday in the 80s. So there was a lot of stuff going on in the office at this time, and so it's going to be a bumpy ride, kids. All right, let's get started. The series launches in July of 1971. It is a quarterly series when it begins and is written by the great Roy Thomas, who is obviously doing Conan at this time. And this first issue will treat you to 20 pages of glorious artwork by Ross Andru and Wally Wood. And it is an adaptation of the first Kull story, The Shadow Kingdom. The second issue will give us the second and final part of that adaptation with the appearance of one of Robert E. Howard's best villains, the Serpent Men. Starting with the second issue, John and Marie Severin will take over the art chores here, and I gotta tell you, they are fantastic. If you get the individual issues of Kull, you're going to see letter after letter praising these two for their artwork, and they deserve every kind word they get. Back then, Roy Thomas said that Kull #1 was his favorite comic he'd written up until that point, and I absolutely agree. This is a phenomenal 2-part adaptation of the Shadow Kingdom. It was an accomplishment for comic books back at the time, and it is amazing. It is phenomenal. And that's why the series ended with the second issue in September of 1971. Didn't I tell you it was going to be a bumpy ride? But don't worry, they would continue Kull's story the next year in April of 1972 in Monsters on the Prowl #16. This features a 10-page story that is the first part in a tale that introduces Thulsa Doom, Kull's arch nemesis. And so Monsters on the Prowl was going to be Kull's new home. This would be how he would be published from here on out, forever and ever, until they decided to bring Kull series back just a few months later in July of 1972. Yeah, Marvel was a house with a lot of ideas back then. So now, for some reason, we're a bi-monthly series. Same creative team, they're wrapping up that original story introducing Thulsa Doom. So starting with issue 4, Roy is going to leave the series and Jerry Conway will take over as writer. And so we're going to start out with issue 4, and it's going to be a series of new stories. They're going to be one-shot, single-issue tales. And these original stories have some really neat ideas. They're really epic. Entire nations rise and fall in the span of 20 pages. My one criticism of these early Conway issues is that the stories are simply too big to fit comfortably in 20 pages. And so I would have loved to have seen these done in like double-sized issues. They really deserved more space. Starting with issue 7, we're going to have adaptations of Robert E. Howard's stories, starting with an adaptation of Del Carte's Cat, which was the only Robert E. Howard story of Thulsa Doom. Len Wein is the guest writer for issue 8, and he adapts Wolf's Head, which was set in historic times but is reimagined here as a Kull story. And there's even ancient versions of the Leopard Men in here, which is really cool. Conway returns with issue 9 and an adaptation of the Swords of the Purple Kingdom. And I think once we get to the adaptations, I think they've really got a pretty good grip on how to do a solid, epic Kull story in only 20 pages. And issue 10 will feature a great original story that will be the end of the run of Jerry Conway and the Severins, as a new creative team will take over for issue 11. Roy Thomas himself will come in to write Kull number 11, which is a adaptation of By This Axe I Roll, with Mike Ploog doing the artwork. And you'll notice that we have gone from Kull the Conqueror to now, with this issue, the title has been renamed to Kull the Destroyer. The adaptation of By This Axe I Roll follows the Howard story up until the end. So it's about some conspirators who are trying to kill Kull in his sleep. And the big twist at the end is that Roy has one of the conspirators turn out to be Thulsa Doom, who uses his magic to dethrone Kull and completely change the direction of the series. But before we take a look at that new direction, why don't we take a look at the letter column here, because there's a little bit of drama in some of those letters. So one of the letters in Kull number 11 brought up a series I'd never heard of before called Sword of Sorcery, which was put out by DC back in the 70s. And there was a reference to this series running a letter that mentioned Kull and Conan. And so the issue in question is issue 4 of Sword and Sorcery. So there's actually a couple letters referring to Marvel's titles. One says, Fafhrd and Grey Mouser always struck me as superior to Conan, Thongor, King Kull, and a host of others. They have the added advantage of brains, something the others sorely lack. By the way, Fafnir and Grey Mouser are the main characters of Sword of Sorcery. And another letter in the same issue says, SOS could be what Conan the Barbarian might have been. I prefer SOS over Conan because Conan relies almost entirely on violence, monsters, swordplay, and other forms of mayhem, which seem to be the entire magazine and not merely an extension of it. Sadly, for those Sword of Sorcery fans, this would be the next to last issue. Issue 5, the next issue, would be the final issue of SFS. And so for issue 11, there's a letter that says that Kull is the best sword and sorcery comic out there. And it has complaints about the other titles that were being put out at the time. And when it gets to Sword of Sorcery, it says, how could you go wrong with Grey Mouser? I'll tell you, the art, it doesn't fit in a well-written book. And so Roy responds to this letter by saying, "Ordinarily, Frank, we don't print letters which plug our competition, since our feeling is that we can't say anything bad about them, and we don't particularly want to. We shouldn't say anything good either, but merely keep a discreet silence. But we've noticed that one of our disputatious competition's titles recently spotlighted a fan letter which castigated our award-winning Conan title, so we thought we'd make an exception just this once. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem likely to be a battle of the letter pages on the subject. The rival title has since gone to a hastily dug grave, while Conan and Kull and Thongor go rocking right along, which fact speaks, we think, for itself." A hastily dug grave. I think that's actually more savage than any Conan story he's written. So anyway, moving on, starting with issue 12, Steve Inglehart will take over as the writer of the title, and Mike Ploog will continue to do the art. And unfortunately, starting with issue 12, you're only going to get 15 pages of Kull, with a 5-page backup story reprinting some random old fantasy story done by Steve Ditko. And no offense to Ditko, but the name of the title is Kull, and that's why I bought it. But even with the shorter story, I do like the monster in issue 13. I think the fire dude is pretty awesome. Issue 13 puts another twist on By This Axe I Roll, saying that the poet Redondo survived his attempt at killing Kull and ends up joining him. He ends up, now that Kull is dethroned, becoming his companion in his adventures. I'm not a big fan of Redondo. He's a non-combatant who is whiny and sometimes annoying with Kull, and it's not a deal breaker, but it's not my favorite thing either. But it's just something you kind of come to accept if you're going to read Marvel Kull. Until the title is canceled again and Kull goes to his own hastily dug grave in issue 15. To me, this was the lowest point in the series. Inglehart shows Kull trying to recruit people to fight Thulsa Doom so he can retake his kingdom, and he goes to people in his past like the hill bandits he used to run with before he was king. It's a solid idea for stories, but Inglehart's scripts feel a little bit run-of-the-mill and bland, but there's only so much he can do with 15 pages of story, and Ploog's art is a little bit mixed. Now, according to what they said at the time, the new direction, new creative team, all that didn't hurt the title enough to kill it, but it didn't raise sales enough to save it. This was a very difficult time. They talk about that there was a paper shortage and that there was a labor dispute that was costing them more money to print the comics, and unfortunately, titles like Kull ended up being the victim. And so that happened in July of 1974. However, a year later, we found out that Kull's grave was a shallow one because the story of the dethroned king continued in Teeth of the Dragon by Jerry Conway, which was published in Kull and the Barbarians #2 in July of 1975. In September, Kull and the Barbarians 3 would feature Omen in the Skull, continuing that story, this time with Doug Minch taking over as the writer. Kull and the Barbarians ended up being canceled with issue 3, so the next black and white story to continue the saga was When a Tiger Returns to Atlantis in Savage Sword of Conan #9 in December of 1975, and Doug Minch is now our regular writer. Now, don't feel like you've got to buy those individual issues. You're probably not going to want to because they're expensive. You can get them in Omnibus or in this handy Savage Sword of Kull collection that Dark Horse put out. They're in volume 1 of that collection. And so now Kull's new permanent home is going to be Savage Sword of Conan, and that is going to be the way it's going to be forever until they decide to bring the series back the next year in August of 1976 with Kull the Destroyer #16. And so Doug Minch is now our new permanent writer. Roy Thomas is going to co-write this first issue, and Ed Hannigan will do the artwork. While I highly recommend reading those black and white stories, if you don't, this is going to be a vital issue to understanding the series because it's going to become very serialized and very weird. And by the way, there is an actual explanation this time as to why they brought it back. So the new circulation manager at the time took a look at the numbers that Kull was selling and was like, hey, this book could make money, let's bring it back. And so they did. And so issue 16 is a recap issue. It tells you what happened in those black and white stories if you missed them. And so one of the big things was that they end up in the Pickish Isles fighting this wizard, and Prowl the Spear Slayer, Kull's constant partner, decides to stay in his homeland to fight this evil wizard, leaving Kull with only Redondo as his companion, which, again, not my favorite thing. But the main thing that you need to wrap your head around is that when Kull returns to his own homeland in the primitive barbarian Isles of Atlantis, hoping to find allies, he finds that it looks like this and is now a big city and a civilized society. His childhood friend Amra is now a king who looks like something that you would see in one of the civilized countries on the mainland. Now, there is an explanation that over the last 10 years, a wizard brought this race of beastmen to Atlantis that built this city, but there is a suspicion that there may be some magic involved. Now, this may seem out there, but Doug Moench is playing on something that Robert E. Howard wrote about this era in history, where Atlanteans would eventually start conquering the mainland where Volusia is and start building kingdoms. And so Kull sees a vision of this and starts wondering if that may be the way he regains his kingdom, or maybe Amra invades the mainland, or maybe one of the other Atlanteans. And so we're going to delve into that concept with issue 17 and Own, and the artwork will be done by both Ed Hannigan and Alfredo Alcala, and I got to tell you, it continues to be amazing. And as trippy as the Kingdom of Atlantis is, the source of the demons that Kull fights in this section of the series is even trippier. So there is a hole in Atlantis, and it goes all the way to hell. And so that produces these hordes of flying man-ray demons that are awesome looking that attack the kingdom. When they go looking for the source of the monsters, they are attacked by that race of beastmen that lives in Atlantis now that I mentioned before. And when they get there, they face this giant tentacled demon, and a freaking god comes out of nowhere at some point, and Kull fights a skeleton with crystal skin, and they're literally fighting in hell. Now, this level of magic and monsters feels a little bit higher fantasy and more like Masters of the Universe than Robert E. Howard. However, it is interesting, the monsters look cool, and my God, this cover is like a heavy metal album waiting to happen. Look at this. Kull is fighting a skeleton with crystal skin in hell with his flaming tiger totem in the background. This is amazing. And so the Atlantis plotline will wrap up with issue 20, and that will be it for this particular creative team. Now, I love the fact that they came in here with tons of ideas, tons of energy, cool monsters, but I will say I didn't find the characters as engaging as I wanted them to be, and it was a bit convoluted. However, this is not the last Kull story that Doug Moench will write, and he will come back to be one of the greatest writers who's ever done Kull. And that will leave us with our final creative team, starting with issue 21 with Dan Glut, and the interior artwork will be done by Ernie Chan. So when Kull and his allies leave Hell, they find ruins that for some reason they mistake for the city of Atlantis, but it becomes clear that they simply emerged in a different part of the world, and that they'll find out later is actually the country of Grondor. And by the way, Ernie Chan is going to continue that run of great artists on this title, and I really like the monster in this issue. He's very interesting, very creepy, very memorable. And by the way, the Kingdom of Atlantis is not going to show up in the rest of this series. I'll talk about at the end how Marvel dealt with it afterwards. Don Glut's stories are solid, but they feel very run-of-the-mill for this kind of book. However, I will say I do like the monsters in this part of the run. He can't just defeat the monsters with brute force. He has to figure out how to counteract the magic that is creating them. And it's kind of like every monster battle is a puzzle that he has to solve. It's like a video game boss or something. Actually, this whole series would make a great video game. And also, there's this monster where Kull actually goes to his home dimension, and this guy is like staggering around his castle drunk, just rambling on. It's very weird stuff. It definitely stretches the boundaries of what you would expect in a Howard-style story, but it's interesting. This final plot line leads up to a major battle with Thulsa Doom. However, the next to last issue, issue 28, does not indicate that the series is being canceled, so it seems like it was just good fortune that they were leading up to a battle with Thulsa Doom. And issue 29 is the final issue and final battle between Thulsa Doom and Kull, and they come up with a very clever and very exciting way to have them actually fight each other, because, you know, Thulsa Doom is a wizard, Kull is a barbarian, but it works out really well. There's a very clever way that Kull defeats him, very ironic fate for Thulsa Doom, very satisfying final issue that restores Kull to the throne. And so issue 29 would be the final issue until, actually this time they didn't change their mind. This is actually the real final issue of Kull. But there is an epilogue in Marvel Premiere 19. Roy Thomas adapted the Robert E. Howard fragment, Riders Beyond the Sunrise. The artwork is by Sal Buscema, and you don't need to read this story, but you're going to want to. It is a wonderful epilogue and a nice cherry on top to the Kull series of the 70s. And then in 1981, Doug Minch will return to Kull, this time with John Bolton, and they will give us Demon in a Silvered Glass, and it will bring in the era of Kull as the thinking man's barbarian. At this point, King Conan had his own title. They needed to come up with a way for Kull to be different, and they went for him being deeper, more philosophical, more epic, and Demon in a Silvered Glass really sets the stage and sets the standard for the great Kull stories we'll see in the 80s. And by the way, both of those black and white stories are contained in the Savage Sword of Kull, Volume 1, or your Kull Omnibus. And yes, Kull will return to Color Comics with some amazing stories, including a couple that will actually have delegations from Atlantis. But neither of those stories, or any issue after that, is going to mention the Kingdom of Atlantis and King Amra. So what happened to it? So Marvel's first attempt to write this off came in the Tiger of Atlantis Chronology, which was in Marvel Preview 19 by Jim Neal. And it says, Atlantis was created by magic, and that it was the ruined city that we saw in issue 21, even though the issue clearly indicated that was not the case. And it makes up a sea voyage that they go on and get lost, and that's how they end up in Grandor in issue 22, it claims. A different explanation will be given in the Kull Comics Chronology in Conan Saga 97 in April of 1995. This is at the very end of Kull's run. This is going to be by Fred Blosser with contributions by Roy Thomas and Jim Neal. And so it's going to say that basically at some point, the magic that caused the city of Atlantis to exist and Amra to become king wears out, and no one remembers it ever happening. And that's why it doesn't come up after the Kull series of the 70s. Of those two explanations, I'm giving my no prize to the second one because it actually fits in with the comics. It's going to be messy no matter what, but at least it didn't have to rewrite anything. And so while, yes, I do feel like there are better Kull stories that have come out since the 70s, I think that there are some really great ones in this series, and that warts and all, it is definitely worth picking up. And I have now read every Kull comic that has ever existed. And I did a guide to all the different Kull comics that have come out and how you can get them, so you might want to check that out. And one happy addition to that list that's come out since then is the new Savage Sword of Conan #9 from Titan Comics. In the back of the issue is a self-contained Kull backup story. It's written by Fabian Nicieza, who is probably best known for his work on X-Men, and it's drawn by Sean Chen, probably best known for his work on Iron Man, but he also got his start at Valiant on Ryan the Future Force. It's cool stuff. I do like it, and just in case it seems a little extreme to pay $7 for a backup story, there is a main Conan story in the issue done by Patch Searcher, so it should be worth your money. And I look forward to more Kull stuff because he really is the sword and sorcery character who would not die. You know, once they canceled that series in the 70s, Marvel kept bringing him back over and over again, and all of it is worth checking out. And, you know, he came to Dark Horse, now he's at Titan Comics, and I'm just looking forward to getting more Kull comics. All right, like and subscribe for more videos. And until next time, see ya.